Um, I wanted before we get started tonight with our speaker, I wanted to, well, I say Happy Mother's Day to everyone here who is a mom. And there was a great article in the Times-Picayune this weekend. I don't know if you all saw that, about a man who was adopted and found his birth mother 66 years later through DNA testing. And it was a fascinating article about he and his birth mother, unbeknownst to either one of them, took tests, and then they happened to find each other through there, and through some other research, they were able to finally make a connection. So it's a great story to check out on NOLA.com. So I wanted to use that maybe to segue into tonight's speaker, Dr. Michelle Boissiere, who is here with us tonight. She is going to talk about genetics for the genealogist, and Dr. Boissiere is head of the Department of Biology at Xavier. She's has a long interest in genetics and genealogy and the intersection of the two. She is going to provide some information to assist genealogists like us with interpreting the consumer genetic testing results that you may get, reconciling history with scientific results, and providing some examples from her own history. Dr. Boissiere has been a faculty member at Xavier since 1994, and her primary teaching responsibility centers on genetics. She has degrees in biology from Xavier and a BS from Xavier, and then MS and Ph.D. from Tulane University. And she's edited and contributed to several biology and genetics textbooks. And she's a lifelong resident of New Orleans, and her family has lived in Southeast Louisiana for 8 generations. So we're very happy to have Dr. Boissiere here tonight, and look forward to her talk. Let me just share your screen.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here this evening and to hopefully help you understand the genetic testing that is available and that many people are using to contribute to their ancestry studies. As I was introduced, yes, I've been on the faculty at Xavier for 29 years. I would like to pretend that I was 3 when I started teaching there, but I believe the gray hair would give that lie away. So who am I? Why was I invited to discuss this topic? Well, for one reason, I have taught genetics for all 29 of the years that I've been on the faculty at Xavier. And I am an 8th generation Louisiana Black Creole. So the combination of what I do and who I am and where I came from kind of makes it an easy connect for me to consider genealogy in the study of genetics that I share with my students on a regular basis. What I hope to discuss with you this evening, my goal is to help to introduce you to genetic genealogy. In other words, you're a member of this organization because you are interested in and perhaps doing your own personal genealogy investigations. But most people who are doing that don't necessarily have a whole lot of training in genetics. So the genetic testing services that are available give you this bank of data, and sometimes you don't understand all of the information that they give you. So hopefully when you leave here this evening, you'll have a little bit more information about genetics, and to make sure it's not just a science talk. After I give you a little bit of science, there will not be an exam, but after I give you a little bit of science, I'll give you a little piece of my own genealogy story. So, genetic genealogy. It's a phrase that if any of you watch Finding Your Roots on PBS with Henry Louis Gates, they talk about genetic genealogy all the time. And it's a phrase that has sort of come into existence over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. Well, the genetics part of that genetic genealogy, genetics is the scientific study of how physical characteristics in living organisms are inherited. So why do you have eye color, hair color, physical characteristics, disease predispositions that in many cases are similar to those of your parents, your grandparents, and other family members? There are several different branches of genetics. The two big branches of genetics are classical genetics and molecular genetics. Classical genetics, as the name implies, is kind of the old-fashioned stuff. You might remember when you took a high school or college level science class doing Punnett square problems like Gregor Mendel did with his pea plants in Austria in the 1860s. Well, classical genetics includes that kind of investigation. And another thing that is included in classical genetics is preparing these pedigree charts, where you're looking at one physical feature. Perhaps it's eye color. Perhaps it's type 1 diabetes. You're looking at one physical feature and outlining everyone in multiple generations of a family that have that particular feature. And you can make predictions about how that characteristic is inherited. The more contemporary, the more modern genetics is molecular genetics. And technically, molecular genetics is even older than I am. It really was born in the 1950s. However, molecular genetics, which is looking at the individual molecules of DNA and the proteins that are made by the DNA, while that has been in existence for about 60 years, within the last 20 years, there has been an absolute revolution or explosion in the field of molecular genetics. So now we are able to do very, very precise analyses of the DNA that we all have in ourselves. So the genetic genealogy, the genealogy part of it, I don't have to tell you, right? This is the looking at historical records, looking at oral interviews, reviewing family lineage, looking at all kinds of data, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, property records, et cetera, court documents, to trace the pieces of an individual's family tree. And in genealogy, family tree charts are constructed to outline who your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, et cetera, are. Well, contemporary genealogy often includes a DNA analysis to complement those historical records, those paper trails, the documents. When we put those two, the science of genetics and the history of genealogy together, when we merge them, I think it's a natural fit, not an unnatural fit. And the reason I think it's really a natural fit, in most branches of science, very little attention is paid to history. The fact is the fact, whatever the fact is now. You may give a moment's pause to think about what we used to think and now what we're doing differently. But most of science doesn't really pay a whole lot of attention to history. But genetics is different. Genetics, by default, analyzes what is going on in previous generations and predicts what will happen in terms of physical characteristics in future generations. So genetics already, long before the merger of genetics and genealogy came into existence, genetics already had an historical view that it took of the scientific facts. And when I talked about what is done in genetics and what is done in genealogy, in genetics, we construct pedigree charts. And in genealogy, people construct family tree charts. Those are absolutely the same thing. So this is kind of a typical pattern of a family tree where you would have this individual at the bottom and their parents, and then grandparents, and then great-grandparents, et cetera. That doesn't look very different from this, which is a classical pedigree chart from a genetics classroom, okay? Where you have this is a married couple, and these are their children, their grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a natural fit, a natural overlap in the pedigree charts that are used in genetics and the pedigree charts or family trees that are used in genealogy investigations. So today, contemporary genetics and contemporary genealogy, how do they fit together? Well, with the advances in genealogy techniques, I think someone needs to mute their mic. DNA controls all of the physical characteristics that you can exhibit. In addition to that, of all the other components in our bodies and our cells, it is the DNA in our cells that we directly give to our children. It is the DNA in our cells that we received from our parents. So DNA is determining what we are doing in this lifetime, what characteristics we are exhibiting, and it's DNA that we're going to give to influence what our children will do. It's DNA that we received from our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents to help us become the people that we are. The molecule of DNA, as is illustrated in this figure, is a long helical molecule that is tightly coiled up upon itself to form structures in cells that are called chromosomes. And I'm sure you've all heard of chromosomes before. So, human beings possess a total of 46 chromosomes in each cell. In those 46 chromosomes, there are 44 that are called autosomes and 2 that are called sex determination chromosomes. The 44 autosomes are in matching or homologous pairs. So that means the 44 autosomes that we all possess, we all have 22 pairs of autosomes. So 22 times 2, that gives us 44. On top of that, each of us has 2 sex determination chromosomes. Males have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. Females have 2 X chromosomes. So when you combine the 2 sex chromosomes plus the 44 autosomes, that's how we get to our total of 46. And this is simply what we call a karyotype. The chromosomes aren't really this pretty. These have been stained with fluorescent dyes. But this is showing us the chromosomes that will be present in a typical cell from a male human. And this is showing us the chromosomes that will be present in a typical cell from a female human. So if you look at these, what you'll see is a pair of chromosome number 1, pair of chromosome number 2, a pair of chromosome number 3, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And then 1 X and 1 Y. Okay. And then the same in the female, with the final pair being the pair of matching X chromosomes. So the 22 pairs of autosomes, these are the 22 pairs of autosomes. These are the 22 pairs of autosomes, and then the pair of sex chromosomes. We don't have time tonight for me to talk about how teeny tiny and just barely important that Y chromosome is, and why the giant size of the X chromosome means females have more DNA and therefore we are superior. That's for a different day. So how do we pass genes to new generations? How do we get genes? How do we get chromosomes, DNA from our parents? During reproduction, each parent gives the child 23 of their chromosomes, not all 46, okay? So if you had a sperm cell from a male and an egg from a female, and each one of them had 46, like the rest of the cells of the body would, the next generation would have 92 chromosomes. That's not human anymore. So to maintain that continuity in chromosome number from one generation to the next, when we are producing eggs or sperm, we actually undergo a special type of cell division process that you may remember the word meiosis, special type of cell division process to make cells that have half the total number of chromosomes, not the full complement of 46. So in this figure, this is a figure of an ovum or an egg cell, and it has 23 chromosomes, so one of each type. And this is a sperm cell, which also has 23 chromosomes, one of each type. So the company 23andMe, right, it's referring to the fact that the one full set, in other words, one of each type of chromosomes, is the number 23. So we received 23 chromosomes from each of our parents, and we gave 23 chromosomes to each of our children. So again, when we look at this, the 23 that you would give to your child wouldn't be a random smattering of 23. It will be one of this one of this pair, one of this pair, one of each of the different types. If for some reason that doesn't happen in a balanced fashion, then of course there would be serious genetic abnormalities. All right. So reproduction favors and absolutely ensures diversity. Okay. Homologous chromosomes, not only do we take one of this pair, one of this pair, one of this pair, and so on, and then from the female, one of each of those. So we're mixing chromosomes from two different people. So that's making an offspring that's not identical to either parent. In addition to that, the homologous chromosomes actually exchange pieces with each other before one is picked to give to an egg cell or give to a sperm cell. So for example, if we look at this picture, so this circle indicates a pair of chromosomes in one of my cells, okay? So if this is chromosome number 1 that's shown here, I got a chromosome number 1 from my mother, and I got a chromosome number 1 from my father. Before I ever produced an egg, these two switched pieces with each other. So now, before I ever made an egg, some of these blue ones, which were from my father, had a little switch and now included a piece of DNA from my mother, and vice versa. So it was possible among all the eggs that I've ever made in my life, some of them, about 1/4 of them, had chromosomes that were pretty much identical to my mother's. Some of them had chromosomes that were pretty much identical to my father's. But I also had some that had combinations of genes that were, well, the version of gene A that I got from my mother and the version of gene B that I got from my father decided to be on one chromosome together so that could be potentially donated to my son. Okay? So when I tell you, and there are more and more layers of this, reproduction as it is designed by God really ensures and favors diversity, mostly because diversity is good for long-term survival of any species. Okay, so, you know, when I look at this and I think about, again, since I have my parents' names and my son's name there, you know, maybe that's why my son has my mother's dimples with my father's musical inclination. I don't know. That's what I make up in my head anyway. And it's scientifically pretty much on point. Okay, so DNA is an incredibly complex molecule. You know, I would say the most complex naturally occurring molecule is DNA. We each have billions with a B, individual nucleotides or subunits in our DNA. Now, those billions and billions of nucleotides aren't billions of different nucleotides. There's only 4 types. There's adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. That's it. So you have repeating adenines, thymines, cytosines, and guanines until you get to however many billions it is that we have, right? So what makes us unique is what is the order of adenines, thymines, cytosines, and guanines in us, okay? The order of the nucleotides in your DNA, that is your molecular identity. And it is way more specific than any other kind of identity test we could give. It's way more specific than a blood type. It is way more specific even than a fingerprint or a lip print. You know how your fingerprints are unique? Do you know that the ridges in your lips are just as unique as your fingerprints? Anyway, so your DNA is your molecular identity, okay? That order of nucleotides, that is what makes you who you are. A little subset of your nucleotides that kind of works together to produce one molecule or give you one physical characteristic, that's what we call a gene. So, in the 1990s, a new technique to analyze DNA was developed. A new technique, a new machine called a thermal cycler. The technique is called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. So it was possible to get the full detailed sequence of nucleotides for 20, 25 years before this, but it took months. And it was really not accurate, and it was labor intensive, and it was so expensive. And then in the 1990s, somebody came up with a new technique to do it that made it faster, more accurate, and cheaper. And that's why we're here today, because with PCR, it became faster and more accurate and cheaper. Because of that, we were able to do the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project was a concerted effort from some of the top research labs around the world to try to get kind of a baseline or reference sequence for what the whole human genetic composition was. Now, I just said we each have billions of nucleotides in our DNA, and we each have our own unique order of A's, T's, G's, and C's. So how can you have a standard sequence for the human genome? Well, the truth is, all the people on this planet, about 98, 99% of our nucleotide sequences are identical to each other. It's amazing to see how many different people there are, how many different types of people there are, but 98, 99 really percent of our nucleotide sequences are pretty much like everybody else's nucleotide sequences. So that's why you can have sort of a standard or reference sequence for the human genome. But the interesting fact is that tiny little 1% that is truly unique to you, to me, is also the 1% that we use the most in our everyday lives, in our everyday functions. So a lot of the DNA that we have, at this moment in time, we can't completely understand what it's doing. It's probably having some type of regulatory function. That's what it looks like at this point. But what we know for sure is the small percentage in us that is really the most unique is the same as the small percentage in us that is used the most. So, basic genetics that we've just kind of done a whirlwind overview of, and connecting that to DNA testing results. One of the first things I'd like everyone to understand is that none of those companies test every single nucleotide that you have. They're not testing billions and billions of nucleotides. They would have to charge a lot more than would be consumer-friendly pricing if they were testing every one of those nucleotides. What they're looking for are short, unique spots in your DNA. They're looking for that small subset that makes you unique. What we call those spots that are unique are single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Okay? So if most people have an adenine nucleotide at a certain position on a certain chromosome, but you have a guanine nucleotide there, that's a single nucleotide polymorphism. That is a SNP. That is a characteristic that you have that the majority of humans do not. Well, we inherit our chromosomes, our DNA, our SNPs from our ancestors. So when you have the same SNPs as somebody else, there is a really good chance you are related to that person, okay? And the more SNPs you have in common with someone, most likely, the more closely related you and that individual are. So all of the testing companies, they're not analyzing every nucleotide. They are analyzing the SNPs and looking for patterns, looking for, okay, so people with ancestry in this particular location frequently have that particular SNP at that spot. People with ancestry on this continent frequently have this SNP in this spot. So that's how the companies can make predictions about where your ancestors have lived over the last several hundred years. So when you are doing a genealogy analysis and you're adding that genetic ancestry analysis to it, you have to keep in mind that geography plays a big role in this as well, right? So ancestry in general is also geography. And DNA analysis for ancestry is also a biological geographical analysis. So the ancestral DNA services, they analyze collections of SNPs to make those correlations about, okay, if this person has this set of SNPs, they probably had ancestors from here. And if this person had this set of SNPs, they probably had ancestors from here. So if your DNA sample has multiple SNPs that are very common in Asia, but rare on every other continent, then you probably have Asian ancestors. And that's kind of the way it works. Now, when the countries get into very specific detail about where your ancestors are, I'm going to tell you to remember geography and remember time. Today, you can pretty easily, relatively inexpensively, fly anywhere in the world you want. And if you're so inclined, you can reproduce with anybody anywhere in the world that you want. 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, that was not the case. And so, nitpicky differences between France, Germany, you could walk from France to Germany, just like you could walk from Louisiana to Mississippi if you wanted to, right? So distinctions made for that, take with a grain of salt, but you cannot swim the Atlantic Ocean. And nobody could swim the Atlantic Ocean 200 years ago. It was hard to even make the journey on a boat 200 years ago. So when you look at the big picture of continents, that's probably scientifically quite accurate. The little bitty detail could be accurate, but not as accurate as the bigger picture relationships. The next little bit of genetics that I think we have to discuss, because many of the testing services make reference to this, is the idea of mitochondrial DNA or genes and Y chromosome genes. And usually the word that the companies use to describe mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA is haplotype. So if any of you have 23andMe, you were given a mitochondrial DNA haplotype, and the men who did 23andMe were given a Y chromosome haplotype. All right, so haplotype, the prefix haplo means half, okay? A haplotype is a combination of SNPs that are always inherited together from the same parent. So they don't participate in that crossing over I talked about. For the 44 pairs of autosomes, there's no haplotypes. For the X chromosome pairs that women have, there's really no haplotypes. But for Y chromosomes, there are haplotypes because the Y chromosome doesn't have a partner. There isn't a second Y in any cell for it to undergo that crossing over process with. So the collection of genes a man has on his Y chromosome is very close to identical to the collection of genes his father had on the Y, and his father, and his father, and his father. So a Y chromosome haplotype can give a lot of valuable information about the direct paternal family line. Okay. The next haplotype, which both men and women have, is a mitochondrial haplotype. So a mitochondrium is a little subunit in cells, in all of our cells, that help us undergo our cellular metabolism. Mitochondria have a little teeny tiny piece of DNA that's all their own, that isn't one of the regular 46 chromosomes. Because that mitochondrial DNA is all by itself, like the Y chromosome DNA, it's not undergoing that crossing over. Okay? And on top of that, every one of us, men and women, get all of our mitochondria from our mother. Okay? When an egg is fertilized by a sperm, the sperm deposits the chromosomes and nothing else. From the first day of existence, the mama is doing all the feeding, all the work, writing out. I'm just giving biological facts here. So mitochondrial haplotypes can tell us who your mother's mother was. All of us, men and women, our mitochondrial haplotypes are completely our maternal line. Okay. So what is the value of ancestral DNA data? First, I should tell you, I have never made 1 penny from any of the testing services. They don't know I exist, I don't think, other than the fact that I have a sample in one of them. All of them use about 1 million SNPs and pretty much the same SNPs. Okay, now we have billions of nucleotides and they all use around 1 million SNPs. Okay. So if they all use pretty much the same SNPs, you get different results from different companies. Has anybody ever used multiple companies and it's not exactly the same? Okay. So the difference in the reports that you might get from company to company, sometimes it's a subtle difference and sometimes it's a huge difference. And I think maybe that's like a quality control error in the testing lab. But the difference is in the mathematical formula. Each company has a team of these high-level advanced mathematicians who write the code, like the computer code, to say this pattern of SNPs means this ancestry, this pattern of SNPs means that ancestry. So although the raw data, the SNPs for all of them is pretty much the same, it's the formulas that they're using to make predictions based on that raw data. That's where you get the differences. So 23andMe, Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, they all have different computer programs to analyze the SNPs that they detect in you. And that's why you tend to get different results from different families. Okay. 2 important facts here. None of those mathematical formulas are really accurate beyond 3rd cousin or 2nd cousin once removed. It starts to get fuzzy. And the reason it starts to get fuzzy is because, again, there are so many layers of where diversity is included in the process of reproduction. The percentage of SNPs that you have in common with someone who is your 4th cousin and the percentage of SNPs that you have in common with someone who is your great aunt are going to fall within the same range. So it's a lot harder to be accurate the further out the number is. Okay. And as I mentioned a little while ago, you can't have complete confidence about predicted ancestry within a continent. So if there's no huge body of water separating people, if there's no mountain range separating people, if there's no desert separating people, there's going to be some fuzziness in the accuracy of those numbers. When you do the genetic analyses, and I know many of you already have, you're going to get messages all the time about you have new cousins, you have new cousins, you have new cousins. If you get a report that you have a new cousin and that person has 10% DNA in common with you, I would pay attention to that and say, who is this person, right? If they have 0.01% in common with you, that's an accident. I mean, they could be related to you, but they also really, really, really could not. So personally, when I get the messages, I look at the percentage and then I make a judgment call on the percentage based on whether or not this is worth my time to actually spend, some time looking into it. And trust me, when you start getting those messages from all these distant cousins, if you share 0.087% DNA with someone, you do not have to invite them to a Christmas Eve Réveillon dinner. Not necessary. You don't know them. Okay. All right. So if you haven't yet done the DNA testing and you're thinking about doing it, I would say talk to other people in the family who might also be interested in doing it, because if everybody in the family goes with a different company, it's harder to make the results match, and it's harder to share information with each other. So if there are several people in your family who are thinking about doing it, have that conversation and try to come to a consensus opinion about which one you all are going to go with. Because again, easier to share the information, easier to interpret the results as a group. So I would say kind of make that a family decision if you're going to do it. And remember, these companies are just that. They are companies. Sometimes I laugh because I am sure Maury Povich has made a lot more money saying the word DNA than I have. And yeah. So some people take their genetics training and make money with it, and some of us teach. So they're all money-making ventures, right? They're businesses. So they're all going to exaggerate how fantastic their product is. They're all going to exaggerate how accurate their product is. Everybody's going to claim that they are the best. And the truth is, remember, they're all using the same SNPs, the same nucleotides, just giving you their opinion, scientific, mathematical analysis opinion, but their opinion versus someone else's opinion. The big companies are Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage DNA, and I think the two biggest are Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. Of them, Ancestry and 23andMe have the largest number of customers by leaps and bounds. So, although they're all kind of using the same SNPs, that gives them an advantage, right? They have more data to analyze. The more data you have to analyze, just from a basic scientific standpoint, the more accurate your conclusions will be. Okay. I will also say 23andMe does use more SNPs than all of the other companies. Probably not an accident. 23andMe is the only one of these companies that was founded by a geneticist. So, all right. So I started off with, who am I? Why was I invited to do this? Taught genetics for almost 30 years, 8th generation Louisiana Black Creole, blah, 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 blah. Well, what I've talked about so far is all about the genetics part of me. So I'd like to spend our last couple of minutes together giving you a little bit of my family genealogy story and how I looked at my family genealogy story a little bit differently after we had the ancestry test. We did 23andMe test results done. So this is South Louisiana, so we use the word Creole for everything. Creole for Creole tomatoes, you name it. So it's everything. So the concept of Creole is a phenomenon that describes the collision of old world people, settling in the new world, where old world is everything on other side of the Atlantic Ocean from us. New world is the Americas, all of North America, all of South America. We know that there was incredible genetic mixture in the new world, right? Because of the colonization, and also because time was allowing people to move around a lot more, right? So we have the primarily European genetic ancestry by the explorers or colonizers, and there was the pre-population by the indigenous or Native Americans, and then another population growth by the import of Africans. So everything we have in this part of the world, in the New World in general, and certainly more so than anywhere else in South Louisiana, The genes that we have, just like our customs, our foods, our music, our religious practices, reflect the same historical patterns that we know, that we've heard about in history class. There are actually studies that show that the biology, the genetics, is just as rich and integrated as the food traditions in South Louisiana are. We see patterns with the mitochondrial haplotypes and Y chromosome haplotypes that also tell that same story that the history books tell us. So when we compare colonization in Louisiana versus colonization in America, yes, I know Louisiana is a state in the United States of America. However, we know that Louisiana is different, and I'm just going to keep pretending it's better, even though I know we're crazy. So if you think about the stories we were told of who were the typical immigrants to the eastern seaboard of North America, the Pilgrims, they were coming to this new world. They were migrating for religious persecution. And if you're leaving your homeland because you're being religious, you're facing religious persecution, probably the whole family travels together, right? So if there was any liaison between colonizer and indigenous Native American and or enslaved person, you pretended that it didn't happen, and it was officially forbidden. Louisiana, South America, the Caribbean, that's not who the typical explorer was. The typical explorer was either a Frenchman or a Spaniard or a Portuguese man who was a businessman on a business trip. I don't think I need to say anymore. The Spanish crown in many places in the New World, you know, the miscegenation, the mixing of races wasn't even illegal, right? So in the Caribbean and in South America, and especially in South Louisiana, that genetic admixture is richer than it is anywhere else in the US. And 23andMe, again, which has probably the biggest database of all, actually has done analyses that report that the percentage of Caucasians who discover a little touch of Black ancestry is higher in Louisiana than anywhere else. And mirror image two, the percentage of African and indigenous ancestry is higher in Blacks in Louisiana than it is in any other state. So, you know, gumbo is pervasive here, running through many of our veins. All right. And if you look further into those studies, a lot of times you see someone who is Black, the Y chromosome haplotype, the male ancestry, it's Y chromosome. It's European, specifically the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, and French. The mitochondrial haplotypes, overwhelmingly African or Native American. And that is true, again, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, and in Louisiana. It's just, you know, it is what it is. And so that's kind of what history tells us happened. And so now that we can do this molecular analysis of the DNA, molecular analysis is telling us the same story the historians have told us. So even on a biological basis, those stories are indeed true. All right. I'd say ancestry analysis is a good thing to add because it gives you extra information. There are many circumstances where there might have been a child born out of wedlock, and so stories were hidden. You know, Black people didn't necessarily get birth certificates, weren't necessarily on census data, couldn't buy property, et cetera, et cetera. All those are pieces of historical information, so that makes it harder to trace ancestry to those kinds of legal documents. And I can say from my own family, my mother is one of 15 children. The youngest one only lived a couple of days when my grandmother was 48. But, you know, my mother had 4 of her siblings who lived as white their entire lives. And so that also puts a wrinkle in the picture because the stories that I have many first cousins who have never really been told the truth about who they are until they take one of these tests and I pop up as a first cousin and they're like, who are you? Like, yeah, I knew you existed. But I was quiet, but I didn't say anything because I'm trying to get mad. All So the DNA testing will give you a new way to look at the ancestry results, the historical records that you have been looking at for years. So where did I get my genes? My father purposely, the lady who was taking the picture my father wanted me to take this picture for kindergarten, and the lady didn't approve of the fact that I had my hair very, very short. I was the sixth of 7 children. My mother was tired of combing people's hair at that point. So my father, realizing she didn't approve of the fact that my hair was short, literally took his fingers and went and made it as messy as possible. Okay, whatever. So that's me, age 4 or 5, kindergarten picture. And that is my mother and my father around the time that they met, which is like 1949-ish. So these are the 2 people from whom I got my genes. So what have I always known? Before I ever took a genetics class, before I ever heard the word genealogy, what have I always known about who I am? Well, I knew that I was from Louisiana and that my family had been in Louisiana for a while. I didn't know how many generations as a young child, but even as a young child, I knew it was a long time. And I knew that my ancestry was mixed, and I knew that was normal for Louisiana, right? I also knew that many of the names in my family tree were French. And I knew that my maternal grandmother did not know either one of her parents. So that's kind of what I always knew. And then when I was a teenager, my first cousin gave the family a gift. And that is, he did a very, very careful, really landmark study of our Ricard family lines. I don't know if any of you have read any of the work of Ulysses S. Ricard. He passed away in 1993, unfortunately. But to tell you he went back 10 generations and he died in 1993, quick fact check. Did he have the internet? He did not have the internet. So Ulysses taught French and Spanish at LSU. So one good thing about being an underpaid professor is that your summers are off. So he had time. And he was fluent in both of the languages that all of the Louisiana documents were written in. So he went from courthouse to courthouse, church to church, hospital to hospital, et cetera, all over South Louisiana, translated all the records, all the property transactions, et cetera, and traced our Ricard family line all the way back a couple of generations in France in the early 1700s. Okay, so at a very early age, we had that piece of information, but really not much information about the rest of my family tree. So I knew, obviously both my parents, my father did not grow up with his father, so we didn't know a whole lot about them. My grandmother didn't talk that much about her family, other than all the men in her family were musicians, is what she told us. And my father was a musician. So we knew way too much about this one. And then this is dead zero still to this day, which we'll get to in a second. All right. So my paternal family line, my father's father. This is a picture of my father's father, which we actually acquired within the last year. As I said, my father did not have a relationship with his father at all. His dad, had distance, had a fiance in New Orleans and a fiance in Baton Rouge. And he and the one in Baton Rouge moved to California, left my pregnant grandmother in New Orleans, whatever. Okay, he missed out. So we do have some information about his family. So this is my grandfather. So we have several generations on his family tree. Now, about 10 plus years ago, I got to these names, Alfred Bell and Prevost. And the only next information I could get from Ancestry.com was in Maryland. And I said, I don't know, that's probably wrong. And it was with some question marks on Ancestry. So I thought, that's a typo because everybody in my family is French and from Louisiana. Okay, cool. So those are some of the names. You'll see the names, Antoine St. Luc Ricard and Lita Tounoir, and Darrensburg. Those are gonna be on my Ricard family tree too, but whatever. Several generations back, it's okay. Right. This is my grandmother, Mama Jean, so my father's mother, and this is her father and her mother. And I have one cousin who is now working to fill in some of these gaps in the family tree. So we have a couple of generations on this side as well. And my brother actually has just last week completed a documentary about the St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 tomb that my brother has just restored, which was bought in the 1800s by my great-great-grandfather, Jean Bean. So don't want to do a cemetery talk. I'll give you my brother's phone number. This is my mom's side of the family. This is my big mama and big papa. My grandfather, Albert Francois Ricard, and Colombo Ricard. So this is the Ricard family tree, which, as I said, my cousin Euless had investigated, 30, 40 years ago, actually. And even there are a few generations beyond this for Antoine de Riotord Ricard. He arrived in Pointe-Coupee Parish in about 1740. So sometimes when people ask me where I'm from, I will say, well, I've lived in Louisiana since 1740, because I have. It's my grandmother. We got nothing. My grandmother was told as a young child, I'm raising you because I'm your cousin. Your mother died in childbirth and your father died when you were 2. The specific connection, how those people were her cousins, she never received. People didn't talk about it. So if you go to one of the cemeteries in Pointe-Coupee, you can find gravestones for a Cornelia Mathis dying in 1890 and for a Selima Colombo dying in 1893. So you can find grave markers for these 2 people, but it's really hard to trace any more for him. Colombo was not a very common name in Pointe-Coupee Parish in the 1800s or today. And Mathis, we have nothing on her mother. So, they talk about, is it Aphrodite rose from the foam of the sea? I think my grandmother probably rose from the foam of False River. I don't know. So that is where I need to take a sabbatical and or retire and do the work to figure this part out. But if you look at all these names, Aristide Ricard, Felicity Honoré, Lecour, Tounois, Porsche, DeQueer. All right. You look at all those names. What you don't see is 50% British and Irish. How could that be? So these are the results that I received from 23andMe. 35.2% sub-Saharan African. Since both of my parents are Black, I know we're mixed, but I didn't expect it to be less than 50%, just because why would it be? But apparently around here, that is not so unusual. The 20% British and Irish, just shocking to me. 16% Iberian, so Spain and Portugal. I've never heard that before. About 14% broadly Northwestern European, so they're not going to pinpoint it to a country, could be France, could be Germany. 4.5% broadly Southern European, so that could be Italy or the southern coast of France. And, with all those French last names, 2% French? Really? Okay. And with knowing my whole life, Selima Colombo, 2% Italian? Really? Okay. So 23andMe gave me some questions. As I was mentioning a few minutes ago, 10 or 15 years ago, I ran into what I thought was a dead end because Ancestry kept pointing me toward people with that Bell and Prevost name in Maryland. And I just said, okay, the Ancestry, you're wrong. I don't know, maybe they're not, right? Maybe they're not. Maybe I need to revisit that and accept that is probably accurate for who they're telling me was the next generation in my Bell family line. The Iberian Peninsula. So Iberia is Spain and Portugal. I never heard any stories about Spain and Portugal, but Iberian Peninsula, that DNA is often grouped with Mediterranean islands that were officially a part of Italy. And so I found out later that Selima Colombo, who was, we were told Italian, was from Sardinia. So I think that's why I like my Pecorino Romano so much. I don't know. So he was Italian, but he was really Sardinian, and being, you know, a Mediterranean island, the Iberian Peninsula genes and the genes on those Mediterranean islands really, really overlap. Okay. Then I look at the small percentages of French and Italian, but those big blocks of broadly Northwestern European, that could all be French. And the block of broadly Southern European, that could all be Italian. So, you know, those are things that they're just not, you know, as specific on. As they get more and more people in the database, they can get more and more accurate about that, right? I was also kind of surprised that there was like not even a half of a percentage of Native American. I just assumed there would be something, and yet not really. So there are surprises that you will find when you put together the historical records and the scientific analysis. There are going to be reasons to say, hey, maybe I need to reinterpret this, you know, or maybe there is another thing that's at least a possibility. It's not something we'll ever be able to prove because we can't go back in time, but it will give you an opportunity to kind of open your eyes a little bit differently and in new, you know, in new ways. So, you know, there's our map with all the places, you know, so many of these places kind of converge on Southeast Louisiana. I've read recently about waves of immigrants from Asia and from Southern India, you know, between like 1880 and 1900 that I didn't realize existed. But, you know, there are many people out there around here with those ancestry compositions as well. So what do I know for sure? I know for sure that these two people were wonderful, wonderful parents to me and my 6 siblings. I am the 6th of 7 children, 4 boys in a row, 3 girls in a row. And when my mother was 37, the day after she had my baby sister, the priest from our parish went to visit her in the hospital, and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Bell, this is so beautiful. You had 4 boys in a row. You had 3 girls in a row. Now all you need is 1 more girl." And my mother said, "Yes, Father, that is exactly what I need." And I had my tubes tied the next day. My mother was a sassy one. Okay. So they did a good job with us, didn't have a lot of money, but they encouraged us to be honest people, to be hardworking people, and to be caring people, to help somebody else if you had the ability to do so. And most importantly, they encouraged us to value each other and to value family. And my father passed away in 2006. My mother passed away almost 2 years ago to the day. At the ripe old age of 91, still sassy, still alert, till she breathed her last, okay? So they taught us, you know, to work hard. If you're smart, go to school. Whether or not you're smart enough to go to college, do something productive with your life, help other people, and keep your family as a precious thing. And we try to do that, even though both parents are gone, we try to do that. I talk to my siblings all the time. Nothing gives me greater joy than looking at my nieces who now have children of their own. The fact that my son has such a close connection to his cousins is something that one of the things I'm most proud of about my own child. So, you know, they taught us to stick together. They taught us to try to be decent people, you know, try to do less damage than you do good. Things I believe, things I choose to believe, things I discuss with my students when I talk about what is and what is not inherited. So I choose to believe that musical ability is inherited. And I choose to believe this, and my evidence for this is my great-great-grandfather. The only pictures we have of him are with the Peerless Orchestra, because he was one of those early New Orleans jazz musicians around the turn of the century. And I don't mean 1999 to 2000, I mean 1899 to 1900. And my father with the Dookie Chase Orchestra in around 1948, 1949. My father played music until the day before he passed away. He did a concert performance at Xavier. So my great-great-grandfather was a musician. Some of my father's uncles were also well-known musicians. My father was a musician, and that is my son. That's about 8 years ago. He died. You know that I had that little baby picture of him up here, playing a jazz fest because he too, plays music. And although he's a psychology major right now, my God, he should have been a music major. He's trying to figure out how to get a music career out of a psychology degree. Ever. And as I said, holding close the family ties. My son had a choice of coming home. He's in Washington, D.C. in school. And he kind of had a choice, we had a financial choice. When are you coming home when the semester ends before you go back to do your next thing in DC? And he wanted to make sure and time it when my niece Celeste graduates from college next week. And he said, well, I have to be home for Celeste's graduation. Okay. And, that's the kind of thing that I love. So this is my son and my mother 1 week before my mom passed away. And these are some pictures of my nieces, my niece and grandniece, nephew, more of my nieces, more grandnieces and nephews. A couple of years ago, my son and more of his cousins. So the fact that we have that very kind of Louisiana thing of keeping that family bond strong is something that is important to me. And I hope that all the faces that you see on this screen who will live long, long after I do, continue to keep that connection strong. That's it. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I will try to answer them.
Tell you something. The Queen was on the same ship as my ancestor.
Really?
Yeah. In 1721.
Wow.
So you can trace back
That far, even for, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Brother named Warren Bell.
Yes, Warren Bell.
Warren Bell was a TV person.
Warren Bell was a TV personality, is my big brother. He is the one who's just completed the documentary about the restoration of graves. Really, it's about cemeteries in New Orleans, cemetery culture in New Orleans. Thank you so much. Yes.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is about the French DNA being only 2%. It is illegal, and you may know this, but for the audience, it is illegal in France to do a DNA test. The only way you can get a DNA test in France, it is ordered by a judge to determine the reason in court. So a French person cannot go on Ancestry.com, they cannot go on 23andMe and order a kit. There's a genealogy society in France that are trying to change the law and court over it. So if they want to get a test done, they have to order it from the United States. They come out a year to order a form and send it back. So what happens with all these companies, it skews the results to the
Absolutely.
And to Scandinavia because there's not a subset of French customers. And Germans, DNA testing is just not very popular because of the Nazi background and so forth.
Right.
So that's the comment. The second question is, I saw that you were descendant of Jean-Baptiste Honoré in Tulane. Do you have more information on that family?
Don't, I need to go and spend a day at my cousin Bernadette's house.
So they were on the great family in Tulane from Point Bay. So those Honorés were three people of color.
Yes.
In the Jean-Noel Deschamps.
Yes.
Plantation, but they did a book on it, which you might be able to get a copy of that might.
I'll do that. And so when my cousin Euless passed away in 1993, he was actually in the process of writing a book, and nobody picked up where he left off. Yeah. But all of his original, literally pieces of paper that handwritten, it's typed, not computer type. His sister has all of that. I just need to sweet talk her.
He did a book on that. Family, so
Please do. That's great. Yes.
That was an interesting explanation of what Creole was in the denomination. Where I always heard it was a strictly French and Spanish.
So I'll tell you what, as long as I knew my name, I knew I was Creole. So I always understood that there are different variations of the word Creole that are used around the world, but it's usually someone who is a descendant of the old world, but who has been raised in the new world.
Racist white people said that, who didn't want to be associated with white people. That's
Correct. That's true.
white people. That's what you heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, not just you. I'm just saying. I didn't say you. I said you. Hey, Grace King.
Being in the library, I remember being in the library at Xavier University, which is an historically Black institution, when I was a student there in the 80s. And, you know, just pulling a book off the shelf and reading something that gave the description of what a Creole was. And it said, this is not to apply to anyone who has any Black heritage. And I started laughing because I'm like, except I promise you, you go to Corpus Christi Church, Epiphany Church, St. Peter Claver Church, all on the 6th and 7th ward. Every one of those people will tell you and mean it and be accurate that they are indeed Creole. Around here, if you've been here long enough, you know. Yep. Yes.
Okay, so I understand the difference, what I call the internal and the external DNA. And what we get from ancestry, all those percentages is more than kind of where you get your features from.
But it's internal too.
No, I get that, but
Because listen, the same DNA that determines what color eyes you have, you know, a few nucleotides down the line is also whether or not you have an increased predisposition for pancreatic cancer. Yeah.
how far back does the SNP that has pancreatic cancer in it? How long is it 5 generations ago? I mean,
It depends because every time we have cell reproduction, and we're undergoing mitosis constantly, right? Skin cells are regenerating. Every time you have cell reproduction, there's a potential that one accident is made, that a nucleotide is put in the wrong place. So that happens all the time. Sometimes when that happens, it creates a better version of something. But a lot of times when it happens, it creates a defect. So it depends. So there are some cases in which the, say, a breast cancer predisposition arose 2 generations ago, and some cases where it arose 5, 6 generations ago. It really depends on the individual case.
with one parent, just keep getting cut in half every time and somebody reproduces, each generation.
Well, in order to give 23 chromosomes to your children, you have to first make more DNA. So that, because you're not giving away from a finite amount that you have. So you have to make more so that you have some to give.
That's how it is. So many questions.